Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala nabina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam amma ba'd. 2 weeks before we took our break for Eid, we mentioned to the brothers to find out who was the first one to distinguish the hadith or to categorize hadith to be 3 categories: Sahih, Hasan and Da'if. Some of the brothers, they sent the answers. Some of them mentioned it, like say Imam Malik. Other scholars mentioned, other brothers mentioned other than them. Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyya rahimahullah says, Majmu' al-Fatawa. He says, وَأَمَّا قِسْمَةُ الْحَدِيثِ إِلَى صَحِيحٍ وَحَسَنٍ وَضَعِيفٍ فَهَذَا أَوَّلُ مَنْ عُرِفَ أَنَّهُ قَسَمَ هَذَا الْقِسْمَ أبو عيسى الترمذي. He says that the first one that is known to categorize hadith to be Hasan, Sahih, Hasan and Da'if is Abu Isa al-Tirmidhi, rahimahullah. And he said that this wasn't known from anyone before him. This is the statement of Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyya rahimahullah, and similarly Al-Dhahabi rahimahullah and other than them. Now the scholars, they mention that what is intended here is that the scholars that have mentioned this before him, Hasan before him, for it's well known that At-Tirmidhi himself relates from his teacher Bukhari that he mentioned Hasan. Similarly, Ali Madini mentioned Hasan. Similarly, Yahya ibn Ma'in mentioned Hasan. Similarly, before them mentioned like Az-Zuhri, and other than them mentioned this wording Hasan when talking about hadith. The scholars, they mentioned that Shaykh al-Islam Taymiyya rahimahullah's statement here, the way we reconcile between this and the rest of the scholars mentioning Hasan is that, number one, either that the scholars in the past that mentioned Hasan before At-Tirmidhi, they intended the terminology by way of the linguistic meaning. They intended the linguistic meaning of Hasan, meaning that narration is good, and not istilahi, not the technical meaning regarding Al-Hasan. The second point that they mention is, if that's not the case, because Shaykh al-Albani rahimahullah also debates this point and says that what was intended by Al-Bukhari and Ali Madini and them was the technical meaning of Al-Hasan, then what it is known is that At-Tirmidhi was the one who became popular with this categorization. At-Tirmidhi was the one who made this categorization popular, is what is intended. That he made the categorization of Al-Hasan, was Sahih, Hasan and Da'if, popular. So this is what the scholars have mentioned regarding the first who mentioned this. As for the first specific one to mention it from a technical standpoint, Allah knows best. But the one who became famous and popular with this categorization was Imam At-Tirmidhi rahimahullah. Then Ibn Hajr rahimahullah, he says, in Nukhbatul Fikr, with regards to maqbul, if it is safe from contradiction or objection, then it is considered to be decisive, called muhkam, meaning that the rulings can be derived from it with confidence. So what he's intending here is that narrations that we have, there are narrations you can act in accordance to, and there's narration that you don't act in accordance to. So a narration can be authentic, but that does not mean that you must act in accordance to what is mentioned in it. So narration could be authentic in of itself, but that does not necessitate upon you to do amal upon it, to do act in accordance to it. So what he's mentioned here, al-muhkam, is the acceptable narration which is not contradicted by anything of similar type, and most hadith are of this kind. Most hadith are muhkam. Now as we mentioned, la mushaha fil istilah, and every science has its own terminology. We're not talking about example in usul al-tafsir, what they intend by muhkam. We're not talking about what other scholars they mention about other fans, they talk about muhkam. Muhkam with the scholars of hadith is an acceptable hadith which is not contradicted by anything of similar type. And most hadith are of this kind. For example, when you say إِنَّمَا الْأَعْمَالُ بِالنِّيَّةِ, you need actionable by intentions, this hadith is muhkam. Why? Because nothing has come in the sunnah to contradict it or object it. When you say, example, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, example, the Prophet, فِي الْبَحْرُ الطُّهُورُ مَأْهُ وَالْهِلُّ مَيْتَتُهُ, that the water is pure in the ocean, nothing has come to contradict this. So these narrations, for example, are muhkam. So long as the narration is acceptable, and there's nothing that's come in the sunnah to oppose it or contradict it or object to it, it is called muhkam. It is called muhkam. Then he mentions how to deal with narrations if we have contradiction. Now this is where the science of hadith shows its importance, alongside the science of fiqh. Why? Because you're going to have narrations that show some kind of maybe contradiction. And as the scholars have mentioned, that al-aqlu as-sahih la yunaqid al-naqlu as-sarih. Or that our correct intellect will never oppose the authentic text. So based upon the understanding of the scholar, he'll be able to reconcile at times, and at times there's abrogation as I mentioned. But this is where the true scholar or the true student, his understanding becomes apparent. So he mentions here, how to deal with any contradictions that may occur in narrations. He says, if it is contradicted by narrations that are sound as it, meaning there are two narrations which are authentic. They're both authentic and they seem contradictory. If we can reconcile between them, then it is a must that we reconcile. It is a must that we reconcile between them, and this is called mukhtaliful hadith. This in the science of hadith is called mukhtaliful hadith, meaning that they have some kind of opposition apparent, but that they could be reconciled regarding them. So mukhtaliful hadith is the acceptable hadith which has something like it, which contradicts it, though one is able to harmonize between them and reconcile between them. And we're going to give an example soon. Thus, if we have two narrations that are both authentic, but there seems to be some form of contradiction, but we are able to harmonize, reconcile between them, then we must do so and act upon both hadith and not drop any of them. Is that clear? If we have two hadith, they seem contradictory to one another, we can reconcile between them and harmonize between them. It is not permissible to drop any of the hadith, because they're both authentic. You can't leave the same with the Prophet ﷺ and say, because there's some contradiction I don't understand. No, so long as we reconcile and harmonize between them, we must take both of them. And this is called mukhtaliful hadith. For example, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, La adwa, wa la tirata, wa la hamata, wa la safar. La adwa means there's no contagion. There's no contagion. But it comes in the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Firra min al-majzum, kama tafirru min al-asad. Run away from the leper as you run away from a lion. The scholars, they say, reconcile between these two narrations, although what is apparent is that they are contradictory. One is telling there's no contagion, and the other one is telling you, do not get close to a sick person because you may get sick. Is basically what it's telling you. The scholars reconcile between these two by saying that la adwa, there is no contagion, means that a disease cannot spread by itself. A disease cannot spread by itself, but rather it spreads by the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For example, coronavirus does not spread by itself. As a Muslim, you must believe that it spreads by the will of Allah. You may even mix with someone that may have had it, but you never got it. Because by the will of Allah is that which spreads it. It does not spread even of itself. There's contagion, but that does not spread in of itself. And the second hadith means that you mixing with a sick person may be a means to you becoming sick. You mixing with a sick person may be a means to you becoming sick, so you take the means of not getting sick. So that's how the scholars reconcile between these two hadith. So la adwa means that there is contagion, but that contagion is only transmitted by the permission of Allah and by the decree of Allah. It does not transmit by itself. And as for firra min al-majdum, run away from the one who has leprosy or sick, the way you run away from a lion, then that means that you mixing with a sick person or a person that has some kind of disease, it may open you up to having or catching that sickness or that disease. And Nawawi rahimahullah mentioned that mukhtaliful hadith, this specific science of hadith or form of hadith, is from the most important forms of hadith. Most important categories of hadith, and one is forced to understand and know it. Because the scholars mention that the one who truly becomes strong in this is a scholar of hadith, fiqh and usul. And from those scholars that were extremely strong in mukhtaliful hadith and able to reconcile between different narrations was Al-Shafi'i and Ibn Khuzaymah. Al-Shafi'i, Ibn Khuzaymah and others, they were very strong in this chapter. Until Ibn Khuzaymah said, bring me two hadith that you find contradictory and I'll reconcile between them for you. Bring me two hadith that you find that are contradictory and I'll reconcile between them for you. That's how strong he was in this specific fan. This shows that, it's mentioned a benefit, that knowledge in reality does not have any age. For Ash-Shafi, anyone know what age he died at? Ash-Shafi, anyone know what age he died at? He didn't die old age. He died at 54 years old, which is considerably young. Nowadays, if you tell someone that a scholar is 54 years old, you say he's not kibar al-ulama. Ash-Shafi was kabir min kibar ulama. He was from the greatest scholars of Islam, and he died at the age of 54. For that reason, Ali Madini said, ilmu laysa bisin. Knowledge has nothing to do with age. Innama al-ilmu laysa bisin. Knowledge has nothing to do with age. Ash-Shafi was a scholar mukhtalif al-hadith. He was a scholar in nasikh al-mansukh, as we'll come to know. He was an imam in fiqh, imam in hadith, imam in every single science. Imam in the Arabic language. So they say he never made lahan once. He never made a mistake in the Arabic language once. But yeah, he died at the age of 54. Showing us that a person tries to take advantage of his life and does not let his time go to waste, because time is more precious than anything you have. Ash-Shafi took care of his time, and at the age of 54, he compiled in knowledge that which Allah blessed him with. Then he says, Ibn Hajr rahimahullah, he says, if the reconciliation or harmonizing is not possible, then the latter is well established. So you have two narrations. One is previous narration, and one comes after it. If we cannot reconcile between them, but we know the dates of the two narrations, one comes after the other, then the one that comes later is called an-nasikh, that which abrogates. And the one that came before is called mansukh, that which is abrogated. This is the science of an-nasikh wal-mansukh, that which abrogates and that which is abrogated. مَا نَنْسَخْ مِنْ آيَةٍ أَوْ نُنْسِهَا نَأْتِ بِخَيْرٍ مِنْهَا أَوْ مِثْلِهَا. Allah mentions that in the Quran, that there are some things that will be abrogated. So if we're able to identify that one has abrogated the other, then which one do we take? The one that abrogates. And we drop the ruling of the one that is abrogated. Now abrogation and naskh is Allah replacing a former ruling with a later one. Is Allah replacing a former ruling with a later one. If you look at the different sciences of Islam, usul al-fiqh, usul al-tafsir, science of musalah hadith, you'll find that they all mention this. All of these terminologies and sciences are interconnected. All the scholars of different sciences benefit from these kind of statements. So it's important that these kind of things, a student of knowledge memorizes and is strong in. Because we study science of fiqh, usul al-fiqh, you're going to go to nasikh wal-mansukh, as we did before. If you go to usul al-tafsir, when we took Az-Zamzami's poem, you went to nasikh wal-mansukh. And now in science of hadith, you're going to again nasikh wal-mansukh. If you're not going to memorize terminology and try to understand and benefit and become strong in these chapters, then you won't benefit much. For that reason, it's important to memorize terminology. Abrogation is known by way of the four ways in the science of hadith. Number one, if Allah's Messenger ﷺ clearly states it, or in the Quran is clearly stated. For example, number one, the Prophet said, "Nahaytukum inni kuntu nahaytukum ziyaratil qubur fazuruha." I used to prohibit you from visiting the graves, but now visit it. فَإِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُ الْمَوْتِ. For indeed it reminds you of death. For indeed it reminds you of death, or تُذَكِّرُ الْآخِرَةِ, reminds you of the hereafter. So here we have a clear text of the Prophet ﷺ, him mentioning to us that one ruling was before, we were not allowed to visit graves. Then a ruling came later on, which was visit the graves. So we here now say, if someone says it's haram to visit the graves, we say to them, no. That ruling has been abrogated by the latter ruling, which is the permissibility of visiting the graves. So here, if someone says to you, we have two hadith. One says it's prohibited to visit graves, and one says you must visit. Are you allowed for you to visit graves? We say the precedence is given to the allowance of visiting the graves, because this one is after the first ruling. Number two, a companion mentions it. That one is abrogated, and the second one abrogated the first ruling. It comes in Jabir radiallahu anhu, قال كان آخر الأمرين من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم ترك الوضوء مما مست النار. Before, in Islam, if you had ate something of meat that was cooked, you would have to make wudu from it. But here Jabir radiallahu anhu says, the last affair of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was not making wudu from that which touched the fire. So here we say that the latter ruling is that you don't have to make wudu from meat that is cooked. How do we have the evidence? From the narration of Jabir. He said, كَانَ آخِرُ الْأَمْرَيْنِ. The last affair of the Prophet ﷺ was this. So the first one is abrogate, the second one abrogates. The third way is what Ibn Hajr mentions here, that we know the dates. That we know the dates of when it took place. By knowing the dates, as the author mentioned, example, it comes in the hadith of Shaddad ibn Aus, radiallahu anhu, after al-hajim wal-mahjum, that the one who did the cupping and the one that got the cupping done to him have both broken their fast. Both of them, their fast is broken. The one that did the cupping and the one that the cupping was done to, their fast is broken. Now, it comes from Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu in Sahih Muslim that the Prophet ﷺ had himself cupped whilst in ihram and fasting. How do you reconcile with two narrations? The Imam of An-Nasikh wal-Mansukh, Al-Shafi rahimahullah, said, and Imam Al-Shafi was one of the greatest scholars when it came to this chapter of Nasikh wal-Mansukh. Until Imam Ahmad praised him highly for that. Al-Shafi mentioned that the narration of Shaddad ibn Aus was during the conquest of Mecca, Fathu Mecca, when Mecca was opened up by the Prophet ﷺ. As for the narration of Ibn Abbas, was when he went along with the Prophet ﷺ in the farewell Hajj. In Hajjatul Wida', the farewell Hajj. Which one came after? Farewell Hajj came after that of conquest of Mecca. So showing us here that the second ruling, if we know the dates, the first one is in the conquest of Mecca, and the second one is during the farewell Hajj. We know the time periods of now. The second one takes precedence over the first one, because the time period is known to us. The scholars have written regarding Nasikh al-Mansukh. From them, Al-Hazimi example. Al-Hazimi, he wrote a book about it called Al-I'tibar. Another than them wrote regarding Nasikh al-Mansukh, where they actually were mentioned to these points. This is the proof for this, why this one is abrogate and this one is that which abrogates. So here Shafi gives us a clear example using the dates. The fourth way that they mention is by way of al-ijma', by the evidence of ijma'. That's important to mention, by the evidence of ijma'. Ijma' itself cannot abrogate because it's not nas. It is not a text. The only thing that can abrogate is a text from the Quran and Sunnah. But ijma' is an evidence that abrogation occurred. Is an evidence that abrogation occurred. So ijma' is used as an evidence that abrogation has occurred, but is not an evidence of itself to abrogate. No one can say that scholars have ijma' and now this ruling is abrogated. No. Ijma' is used as evidence that an abrogation has occurred, that has taken place. But ijma' in of itself cannot abrogate. That which abrogates is the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That which abrogates the Quran and Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. For that reason, they say abrogation is specific to an-nas. And we study an-nas. An-nas is the Kitab and Sunnah. Is an-nas. And can only occur by way of them, but ijma' may indicate that an abrogation has occurred. Then Ibn Hajr rahimahullah mentions, if the above is not possible, number one, we couldn't reconcile and harmonize between two narrations. Number two, we cannot do abrogation. There's no abrogation that took place. Or we cannot identify if there's an abrogation that took place. We're talking about hadith. Then we go to the third step. If the two are not possible, then we try to find a way to give preference to one of the narrations. We have to do a tarjih. We have to do what is called a tarjih. Try to give preference. We're trying to give preference now to one of the narrations. This is done due to different factors. We try to take different factors to try to identify why this narration is given preference over the other one. To try to understand which one is stronger. Al-Hazimi rahimahullah, he mentioned that there are 50 ways to do a tarjih. 50 ways he mentioned, Al-Hazimi. Al-Iraqi, who is this teacher of Ibn Hajr, who Ibn Hajr spent more than 10 years studying the science of hadith with, and he wrote Alifiyat al-Iraqi, the 1,000-line poetry of the science of hadith. He mentions that there are more than 100 ways to do a tarjih. That there's more than 100 ways to do a tarjih. Showing us how these Imams, rahimahumullah, knowledge had opened up for them vastly. As-Suyuti came later on and he summarized all of that to 7 types. To 7 categories of how tarjih is done. As-Suyuti came later on and mentioned that there are 7 ways or 7 categories of how to do a tarjih. How to prefer this hadith over the next one. The affairs that it goes back to in reality is, for example, the conditions of the narrator. We have a narration which is full of silsilatul dhahab, example, a gold chain. And we have another narration that's not really a gold chain, but it's strong narrators. Which one's going to give preference? The gold chain. For example, some of them they mention Imam Ahmed, and Shafi, and Malik, and Nafi', and Malik, and Nafi', and Ibn Umar. And Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They say this is silsilatul dhahab. You have 3 Imams, and then after that, Nafi', Ibn Umar, which is Sahabi, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You have a chain like this, and then another chain that is a bit weaker. Which one you give preference to? This chain. For example, they'll say. So showing us that a way you can do preference is the chain of narration, the condition of the narrators. Or where the narration took place. This one took place in Mecca, this one took place in Medina. How it was reported. The different wordings we'll learn, like قال, أخبرنا, حدثنا, أنبأنا, بلغنا. These kind of wordings you'll find in the science of hadith, where the narrators narrate narration by way of this. An. We'll learn an is very problematic at times. You have to go back to different wordings that were used. And you could do tarjih by way of that. So, or maybe the wording of the narration that was used. Maybe the wording of the narration that was used. So here, there's different ways of doing tarjih, and that is what the scholars of hadith, they try to identify. Then he says, we've followed all 3 steps. We cannot harmonize between narrations. We cannot identify al-nasikh wal-mansukh. We cannot identify a tarjih and prefer one over the other. we go to the fourth step, which is at-tawaqquf, which is to basically take a middle stance and withhold. Take a middle stance and withhold. So he says, lastly, if neither of the above is possible, then one takes a middle stance and withholds by not endorsing or rejecting the narrations. You don't endorse any of them and you don't reject them. That's important. Some people think at-tawaqquf means you reject. No, it's not tasaqut. We're not dropping any narration here. What we're doing is we're withholding. We're not going to take any of the stances because we don't know which one is stronger. Thus one ceases acting upon either of them until it is made clear which one is stronger. Until it is made clear which one is stronger. So here we have four things. Who can identify the first one? If we have two narrations that look contradictory, what is the first thing we try to do? We harmonize. What's the second one? Check if there's kind of a naskh al-mansukh. If there's any kind of naskh that took place. The third one? At-tarjih. And the fourth one? At-tawaqquf. At-tawaqquf. Now, you'll find that some of the scholars, they even do at-tawaqquf, and they're scholars of this science. For example, Ibn Khuzaymah rahimahullah, they relate from him that in one narration he did at-tawaqquf. He couldn't, although he said, bring any narration to me and I'll show you that they don't contradict each other. At one time, in some moments, he did at-tawaqquf. And Shaykh al-Islam, for example, comes later on and shows the tarjih between them, or the harmonization between them. So every scholar is different in their understanding of the different texts. Then he says, rahimahullah, Ibn Hajr mentions, is that clear so far? That when we have contradicting narration, that's the four steps we have to take. Then he says, mardud reports. So we did maqbul, which is acceptable reports. We did maqbul, which is acceptable reports. Now he's going to go to mardud, rejected reports. Now, the rejection of reports goes back to two things. A narration being rejected, in reality, goes back to two things. He says, as for the mardud report, it is considered, it can happen either due to as-saqt. As-saqt means something is dropped or missing. As-saqt means something is dropped or missing from the chain. Someone is dropped or missing from the chain. That's as-saqt. The second one is at-ta'n. Something affecting the soundness of the narrators. That is how we identify a mardud narration. Two things. One is as-saqt. Someone is missing. There's someone that is missing in the chain. Or someone is dropped in the chain. We have to identify where it is, why it is, and who it is. The second type is at-ta'n. The narrators themselves are been spoken against, criticized, and there's something that affects the soundness of their narrations. These are the two means that lead to mardud narrations. The first one is what he'll go through first, is as-saqt. Something which is someone who's missing or dropped. Now that dropping or that missing narrator could be at the beginning of the chain, from the starting of, or from mention from the compiler himself. For example, Bukhari says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He dropped the whole chain. He didn't mention anyone. He says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Here he dropped the whole. Imam Bukhari never met the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. But he said, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. This saqt took place from the compiler of the book. Al-Bukhari, for example, here. He says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He never met the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم. So he dropped the whole chain. The second one is at the end of the chain after the tabi'i. So example, a tabi'i says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Sa'id Musayyib comes and he says, قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. Or he says, عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال, or something like that. And the third saqt is anywhere else. Now, we'll only take the first one today. The second we've already studied a few weeks ago, which was mursal. And the third one we'll study again. We'll mention the second and third one again next week. But the first one is called mu'allaq. The first one is called mu'allaq. So if the beginning of the chain, from the compiler there is saqt, there's some kind of dropping of narrators, it's called mu'allaq. Mu'allaq is where one or more narrators consecutively are deleted from the chain. And it occurs from the compiler of the book or the compiler of the narrations. For example, Bukhari, for example, Muslim. And we mention Bukhari does this often. Bukhari does a ta'liq or mention mu'allaq narrations often. We'll mention how many he mentions in this book. So mu'allaq, in example, the author says the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said. Or that all of the chain is deleted up to the companions. And we'll mention that because Imam Bukhari at times mentions and Aisha, قالت Aisha radiallahu anha عن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم. He dropped the whole chain and he only mentioned Aisha. Now the ruling of mu'allaq is a weak narration. Why is that? Anyone know why? Yeah, but that's right. We don't know what the narrative is that dropped. But what is from the condition of a sahih narration? Ittisal sanad. Mu'allaq, the chain is not connected. Bukhari never met the Prophet ﷺ, for example, when he does ta'liq. So from the reasons why mu'allaq is rejected, is it doesn't meet the conditions of a hadith which is sahih. And from those conditions is ittisal sanad. The chain is not connected. Now, as-sahihain, so in general, mu'allaq narrations are rejected. They're a form of hadith which is da'if. They're a form of hadith which is da'if. Now, sahihain, Bukhari and Muslim, they have mu'allaq reports. Their rulings, the scholars have mentioned, they're different. In the sense, everything which is in Bukhari and Muslim, or that which Bukhari and Muslim relate, the ummah talaqatha bil qubul. The ummah have accepted them and don't reject them. That's in Bukhari and Muslim. But mu'allaq narrations in Bukhari and Muslim do occur. And if it is a form of weakness, we must identify how are they authentic. In Sahih Muslim, there's 14 of them only. In Sahih Muslim, there's only 14 mu'allaq reports. Meaning where Muslim does not mention the chain, or he drops some narrators, and he mentions it from different narrators, or from the Prophet or from a Sahabi. All 14, except for one, the chains are mentioned in Sahih Muslim himself. So there are 14 mu'allaq narrations. 13 of them, the complete chains, are mentioned in Sahih Muslim in other places. So the 14th one, the chain of it is mentioned in Sahih Bukhari. So the mu'allaq reports of Imam Muslim are all authentic. The mu'allaq reports of Imam Muslim are all authentic. Because 13 of them are mentioned in Muslim, and one of them is mentioned in Bukhari. The chain is mentioned in Bukhari. As for Bukhari, is more problematic when it comes to mu'allaq narrations, because he mentions 1,341 of them. He mentions 1,341 of them. All of them are mentioned with his chains in Sahih Bukhari itself, except for 159. Now there was an Imam that actually took all of these narrations and he found the chains for them and he ruled upon them, and that is Ibn Hajr rahimahullah. In his book called Taghliq at-Ta'liq. Taghliq at-Ta'liq. Ibn Hajr rahimahullah, he paid great concern to Al-Bukhari. Ibn Hajr rahimahullah, may Allah reward him and have mercy upon him. He served Sahih Bukhari better than anyone else have served it in history. Ibn Hajr, he wrote regarding Bukhari, defending his ta'liqat or mu'allaq narrations, and other than that, and the stance of Bukhari better than anyone else does. As for the ones that say Muslim, all of them are authentic as you mentioned. As for Bukhari, then it is more problematic. They come in different terms or different forms of him relaying it. Example, there's two types of siyaq. This is important to understand. We mentioned this before in our class of Al-Majmu'. You have sighatul jazm, a definite form of relaying a narration. Example, qala, he said. Akhbarana, he related to me, reported to me. And you have sighatul tamrid. You have an indefinite form of relaying, which example, ruwiya, it was reported. Qila, it was said. Like this. If it is reported by sighatul jazm, a definite form in Sahih Bukhari, then Ibn Salah, he mentions that which comes with a definite form in Sahih Bukhari indicates that his chain is considered authentic with Imam al-Bukhari. So if you see Bukhari mentions a mu'allaq narration and he says qala, akhbarana, for example, like this, or with a definite way of sighatul jazm, then they mention that what al-Bukhari is mentioning here, that it is authentic. If it is by way of sighatul tamrid, then you must research it. Does not mean that it is weak, but what it means is that it is more, is to be researched and looked into. But does not necessitate it is weak. Example, mu'allaq. Al-Bukhari says in his Sahih, in Sahih Bukhari, Bab ma ja fi ghusl al-bawl. That which has come regarding cleaning oneself, washing oneself from urine. He says, وَقَالَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم لِصَاحِبِ الْقَبْرِ. The Prophet said to the companion of the grave, لَا يَسْتَتِرُ مِنَ الْبَوْلِ. كَانَ لَا يَسْتَتِرُ مِنَ الْبَوْلِ. That he never used to clean himself properly or protect himself from the urine. Here, Al-Bukhari says, قَالَ النَّبِيُّ صلى الله عليه وسلم. That is a mu'allaq narration. But this narration, obviously, we all know, it is found from an authentic chain from which Sahabi, anyone know? Who relayed the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ of the two Sahib al-Qabrain. إِنَّهُمَا لِيُعَذَّبَانِ وَمَا يُعَذَّبَانِ فِي كَبِيرٍ أَمَا أَحَدُهُمَا فَكَانَ يَسْتَحِي مِنَ الْبَوْلِ وَمَا الْآخَرُ كَانَ يَمْشِي بِالنَّمِيمَةِ. Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. It's reported in Bukhari as well in Muslim. So here we have a mu'allaq narration, but obviously Bukhari mentions it elsewhere as well. Another form of a mu'allaq narration where he mentioned from a Sahabi, قال البخاري في باب من صام رمضان إيمانا واحتسابا. Chapter of the one who fasts iman out of fasts Ramadan, believing in it and seeking the word in Allah. قالت Aisha. He said, وقالت Aisha. Bukhari says, Aisha said, and the Nabi sallallahu يبعثون على نياتهم, that the people will be resurrected based upon their intention. This narration obviously found in Bukhari in other places where they connect the chain. Now let me ask, why is Bukhari doing this? Why would Bukhari not mention the whole chain? Al-Bukhari, or Sahih Bukhari, is a book of fiqh. Sahih Bukhari is one of the strongest books of fiqh that you'll find. And the chapter headings in Bukhari are the fiqh of Imam Bukhari. Many people don't know that. The chapter headings that Bukhari placed in his book Sahih Bukhari is his fiqh. Is his understanding of the narrations. So from the reason why Imam Bukhari did that, mentioned ta'liq narration, because he would repeat narrations often. And him repeating it, he did not want to mention the chain, because the chain is mentioned elsewhere in the book. So to summarize and not make the book extremely long, at times he would drop the chain and only mention the text. Why? Because he wanted in that chapter heading the benefit of that text. The benefit of that text. For example, this narration, washing oneself from urine. He mentioned it, إِنَّهُ كَانَ لَيْسَ مِنَ الْبَوْلِ, that he wouldn't protect himself from cleaning himself properly from urine. Shows that you must wash yourself properly when you urinate. This was his fiqh. He mentioned his fiqh, his point, or his opinion, and then the evidence came after it. But he didn't want to mention the complete chain because he mentioned it elsewhere. From the narration of Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhu. Nonetheless, mu'allaq is from the forms of a weak narration, and you must research into its authenticity. Why? Because one of the conditions of a sahih narration is missing here, which is ittisal as-sanad. So we'll stop with this much, inshallah. The homework will be to try to identify that one narration in Sahih Muslim that is chain is mentioned in Bukhari, but is mu'allaq in Sahih Muslim. It's very simple to find and identify. If you just search it, the scholars will mention it. So Sahih Muslim has 14 mu'allaq narrations. One of them, the chain is not mentioned in Sahih Muslim, but is mentioned in Sahih Bukhari. You have to identify that narration. That is the homework. We'll stop with this much. If there's any questions, quick question, I'll take now. If not, yes.